Next concept I want to tell you about is that we may have a diagram with multiple front doors. So imagine that this job training program is, is run by someone who has, who is famous and has, is very well known in different industries, and they can potentially write recommendation letters that change the career prospect of a person. So in that case, there is this other confounder, which is receiving a recommendation letter from that well-known person who's involved, who's like the instructor of this program or somehow involved, right? So I'm going to write it as recommendation letter, but I mean the binary variable that represents whether that person received a recommendation letter. And this recommendation letter has impact on Y based on what I explained, right? And also, it is only for a subset of people who participate in the program, right? So a person must be already in the program to have exposure to potentially receiving that letter. That's why the arrow goes from here to here. Now, you see another causal pathway that goes from T to Y, and it respects the direction of all the arcs involved. That's why it is another open door. So what you're currently seeing is a causal diagram with two open doors, two front doors, and three back doors. What we want to do is keeping all front doors open and closing all back doors. So why do we want to do this? Because when we talk about the impact of T on Y, it is not just a direct link that this job training program just changes something fundamentally in the participant, that they just become a new person who would have a different future. Not just that, but also there is this recommendation letter aspect of the story, that some people will receive the recommendation letter and just the existence of that letter, just having that letter, changes their future. In that sense, I want to keep both of these front doors open. But there are some situations where you're doing a causal analysis and you want to study the impact of a job training program on earnings in 3 years, not including the recommendation letter effect. If that is your subject of study, which is a very unusual thing and a more complicated kind of research question, then you also close this other front door. But in our example, since we don't mind that the impact is the impact that goes through a potential recommendation letter, we keep this open and we keep this open. And we close these three. Questions? So the next concept I want to tell you about is a pre-closed backdoor. I know it's kind of strange. It's just a terminology from causal analysis. Sometimes we have some causal paths that are backdoors and are already closed. So that only happens when we have a so-called collider variable. So let me tell you about what it is. Imagine that being graduated from a top university matters for income in the future, right? You are here at the top university of Canada, one of the top universities of the world, so you would know that. So I write top university, but this means being graduated from a top university. And then you define what a top university is. So therefore, for every person, it's yes or no, right? And just for the sake of explaining what a pre-closed backdoor is, imagine that the way that top university and earnings in 3 years are connected to each other is that there is another variable impacting both of them. For example, there is top high school grades. Someone needs to have top high school grades to be admitted to a top university so that they have exposure to the possibility of being graduated from a top university. And back to the idea one of you mentioned about motivation. let's say having top high school grades also means a bunch of other things. So it is a proxy for measuring some other things, such as motivation, soft skills, communication skills, time management, just some general soft skills that are somehow reflected in high school grades. And it is not the grades per se, but having those skills that is helpful for having higher salary in the future, right? So when you think of this kind of measurement to reflect some other more fundamental things such as motivation and soft skills and communication and so on, then the direction is from high school grades to Y. And imagine that there is another factor that impacts whether someone can get admitted to a top university to then eventually be able to graduate from top university. And that factor is the fact that top universities are not equally accessible to rich and poor. So someone who comes from a rich family, so someone who has, let's say, rich parents, having rich parents is a factor that impacts whether someone gets to be admitted to a top university and eventually graduate from it. And back to the reason why, back to the reason that the job training program wasn't free and the amount of money, or how well someone could afford it mattered for being able to participate in it. Someone who has rich parents also is more likely to be able to participate in the job training program. Now, what you see here is another backdoor. Why is it a backdoor? Because when we go from T to Y through this door, through this causal pathway, we are moving in the opposite direction of some of the arcs. And this backdoor is what we call a pre-closed backdoor. So pre-closed means that it is already closed. We don't need to adjust for a variable on that path. Why is it pre-closed? Because there is a special variable on this path. The variable top university is positioned on this path such that there are two variables pointing to it. So that's why the top university is a collider. As it is a collider, the top path you see on the causal diagram is a pre-closed backdoor, which means that we don't need to adjust for any variables in our propensity score weighting. So that's the causal diagram. This causal diagram is telling us that in order to make causal claims, potentially, we still don't know if we will be able to do it. This is not a guaranteed process. We go through the process, and maybe halfway through the process, we see that we are unable to make causal claim, right? Even if the process succeeds and we make causal claim, that causal claim will have many disclaimers. It will be under 3 strong assumptions. So this causal diagram tells us that in order to make a causal claim using observational data about how T impacts Y, we need to adjust age. So either we need to find data on the age of these individuals, or we need to do new data collection. We need to adjust for education, and we need to adjust for previous earnings. So everything I explained was just step number 0 of the process, and probably the most difficult one. So let's take a quick break, then we go through the other steps, which will be easier. Thank you very much.